Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Evening Stories Festival and this panel called Writing from the Spectrum, How a Late Autism Diagnosis Shaped My Work. I'm Sarah Shaffi, and tonight I'm going to be talking to Holly Smale and to Sara Gibbs. There's going to be time for audience questions for the last 15 minutes or so of this event, so please do ask anything you want of our writers. And now I'm going to introduce them, and they will come up in just a second. Holly Smale was unexpectedly spotted by a top London modelling agency at the age of 15 and spent the following 2 years falling over on catwalks, going bright red and breaking things she couldn't afford to replace. By the time she'd graduated from Bristol University with a BA in English Literature and an MA in Shakespeare, she had given up modelling and set herself on the path to becoming a full-time writer. Geek Girl was the #1 best-selling young adult fiction title in the UK in 2013. It was shortlisted for several major awards, including the Roald Dahl Funny Prize. She's gone on to write more Geek Girl books and a new YA series about a group of sisters. Sara Gibbs is a UK-based comedy writer, graduate of the National Film and Television School's Writing and Producing Comedy course, and prolific tweeter. Her broadcast credits include Newsjack, Dead Ringers, The News Quiz, The MASH Report, and Have I Got News for You? She is the co-founder of satirical online women's magazine Succubus and the founder of the First Laugh comedy writing competition for new writers. And she's also written extensively for satirical websites, including College Humour and the Daily Mash. Having received a late autism diagnosis at the age of 30, Sara uses humour to advocate for a better understanding of autism and neurodivergence. And Sara is the author of Drama Queen, which came out this year. So if you can join me in welcoming them both to the stage.
Those of you who follow me on Twitter, true to my word. Okay, absolutely no one.
Welcome both of you. I'm going to start sort of towards the end, if that's okay. Sara, there's a line in the introduction to your book which says, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So given that, I'd love to start by getting the both of you to talk about your sort of individual circumstances quite briefly. Perhaps you can tell us about your diagnosis and then we can work kind of backwards from there. So, Sara, if we start with you, I introduced you by saying you were diagnosed when you were 30. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, much like Holly, I was spotted, not by model scouts, by a nosy relative who noticed that I was weird and said, you're autistic, right? And I was like, I'm nothing like Rain Man. I'm rubbish at maths, which I don't know if there are any autistic people. If there are, don't make any noise whatsoever. We hate that. That's kind of a cliche, the Rain Man thing, and that's movie autism, not real autism. And she sort of explained to me what autism can look like and how it can look like in and I hesitate to say this because I don't think autism is gendered, but how it can look like in people who've been missed because society has, say, sexist expectations or they've been socialised differently or whatever. And I sort of had to hear her out because I was stuck next to her at a family party and she had my ear. And I, just to sort of shut her up, bless her, I'm very grateful to her now, I went home and I Googled it and it was just like reading a profile of myself. Like I was kind of scared someone had been following me around with a notebook. And I was very, very lucky that my husband had private insurance through work. And we managed to get them somehow to fund my diagnosis. And so it was like 2 months from the, you're autistic, right, to diagnosis. So it's like a lot to process in quite a short amount of time.
We'll definitely talk more about that and about some of the other things you mentioned as well. But first, Holly, tell us about your story.
So I'd had the word autistic kind of thrown at me for my entire working career because Geek Girl, Harriet is very, very clearly autistic. And so ever since it came out, literally people would be like, she's autistic, right? And I'm like, what? No. She's based on me, so she can't be because I'm not. Right to the point of National Autistic Society asking me if she was autistic and me basically telling them where to go. So I'd had that word thrown at me, and because I'm autistic, I would go away and research, and I would come across, lacks empathy, can't make eye contact, good at maths. And I would go, that's not me, and I would basically walk away again. And then we're all adults here today, aren't we? Mostly. There's no young children. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not, but it's just a slightly awkward story. So I came about my diagnosis because last year, after, months and months of isolation, during one of the lifts, I basically tried to go on a date from Tinder. And before we got on the date, I managed to say something spectacularly insensitive on text message, and it blew up. Like, this dude screamed at me for about 6 hours. Like, he had, I don't know what he was, well, I do know what his issues were, but anyway, for whatever reason, I had upset him in something that I didn't understand what I had done, that upset him so badly that he screamed at me for 7 hours, and I had a full meltdown, like a full dramatic, don't know where I am, the whole day disappears. Like, I find myself huddled under a blanket, like scratching myself, which is what I do when I'm having a meltdown. And I've been doing that since I was a kid. But when I came to, I was like, that's not normal. I'm pretty sure it's not normal to pass out like that and black out when you're like in distress. And it feels like this is so familiar, doing or saying something that I don't understand what I've done or said, but it really, really upsets the other person. And the stuff coming at me was, you're a narcissist, there's something wrong with you, clearly you lack any empathy, clearly, and all of these sort of accusations were coming at me. And I just hit a wall. And after nearly 38 years of being essentially traumatized, I went, I can't do this anymore. And I went onto the internet and I Googled female autism, which obviously doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But suddenly autistic women started coming up on my thread. And I went down the rabbit hole. And I think within about 12 hours, which it was literally set overnight, 12 hours, like Sara, I knew. I watched all the YouTube videos. I was like, that's me. I know that's me. And it was the weirdest feeling. I cried for like a full night. But I had to go private because I rang up a doctor and said, I'd like to know what the process is for an autistic diagnosis when you're an adult. And she went, how old are you? 38. Oh, no, that's the sort of thing they'd have picked up at school.
Wow.
And I went, well, they didn't, did they?
Yeah.
And she went, well, I'm not just going to put you forward. You're going to have to prove to me why you think you are. And I went, I don't like the tone of your voice, so I'm going to be putting my phone down now, and put the phone down.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I had to go private because the NHS wouldn't even consider me.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely touch on that a bit later. You're both obviously writers. I wanted to sort of, I guess, set the kind of, not tone for the rest of the discussion, I can't think of the right word, ironically, but talk about a little bit about language and about whether you personally describe yourself as an autistic person or a person with autism or something else, and why you perhaps choose that term. So, Holly, do you want to take this on first?
Yeah, I'm an autistic person.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm an autistic person, much like I'm a Jewish person, not a person with Judaism.
Yes. It's not something that you can just take off at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's your neurology, and it's how your brain is literally wired and your body is literally wired. So to say person with autism not only suggests that it's something you can take off, but it's also a suggestion that you're a human being that has this other thing that's negative. And you're like, it is my wiring. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You sort of, I think, have both of you perhaps hinted at this, but I don't imagine you got a diagnosis and then the next day you were like, everything is cured, everything's hunky-dory, like I'm sorted. What was there a feeling of relief in getting a diagnosis, in getting a name, or was it that you were still sort of unpacking so many years of trauma and so many years where you'd been affected by something you didn't have a name for, or that people weren't willing to name in that way? And we'll talk about some of the other labels that you were sort of slung at you in a bit. Or was it a mix of that kind of relief and then what happens next?
It's an emotional roller coaster. Like, I mean, I knew I was autistic really before my actual diagnosis, because having done all the research and knowing that it fitted me, I kind of knew. But during the actual diagnostic session, which was really long, and ironically, when I spoke to the clinical psychologist, she was like, I knew you were autistic before I met you, because you only had to look at how many pages you sent me as in your write-up. She was like, you sent me 16 pages typed up. And I was like, yeah. She was like, yeah, I knew that. And what was really nice was that she gave me a diagnosis on the spot. Like, she didn't make me wait for like a comeback. And I was like, are you sure? Because there was this need almost to feel like I'd gone from being someone who maybe had been pushing against it to being someone who desperately needed it. Because I was like, this is an answer I feel like I need. I feel like I need to understand myself. And when she said yes, this just wave of relief hit me. And it's been a roller coaster, and definitely like there was a huge period of grief, like anger at the adults around me when I was a kid. Why didn't they pick up on it? Why didn't they help me? Why were they letting me like crawl in cupboards and scratch my face when I was little, and saying that I was sensitive, so there was a lot of grief and anger and pain. But there was also a celebration, and I honestly think that the last year since my diagnosis has been the most life-changing year for me. And I've gone from someone who has been uncertain and hating themselves to genuinely, day by day, I become more myself now, and I become more unapologetic for who I am. And that is like, it's momentous.
Sorry, you've nodded away for like quite a bit of that.
Like the Churchill dog over here. I mean, really, really similar experience of grief and anger. I think when people talk about grief and autism, there's two different ways that they can mean it. And I think the way that Holly and I both mean it is grief for what could have been if we'd have known, and grief for all the situations we put ourselves in that we didn't have to. And, anger at the people around us for not only neglecting to notice, but also making the worst possible judgments about us, assuming the worst possible intentions when we were in pain and in trouble and we needed the people around us, and the people around us were calling us all sorts of hideous things that didn't belong to us. So there was a lot of that. And I think the other way that people mean grief is sometimes they mean when some parents of autistic children find out their children are autistic, they grieve the child they wish they'd had, which I think sucks. But that's not how I mean it, and not how Holly means, I'm sure, not to speak for it. No. But also, I mean, just total relief, and finding other autistic people was the best part of it. It was like a homecoming, because when you don't know what's going on with you, and your whole life you feel so different, and so uniquely different, because you can't, everyone else who is autistic and undiagnosed is probably hiding it. And so you have no idea that there are people out there who are also having these like massive meltdowns that can't be explained, and screaming terrible things that they can't control, and all these things. You think you're alone, and you think you're the most uniquely terrible person in the world, and then you start to meet other autistic people, and you're like, oh, these people are great. If I'm like these people, that's all right, isn't it? I don't mind this. And that's where, for me, like my whole social landscape has changed. There are people who are no longer in my life because they can't accept my diagnosis. And ironically, these are the same people who are the quickest to give me the worst possible labels. They can't get their head around this one. But then there are people like Holly, who is an amazingly friend of people who are like actually here in the audience, who I've met on Twitter, who are just amazing, wonderful people. And I don't know where I'd be without them. And it's such a supportive, incredible community. So it has been absolutely life-changing in the 3 years since diagnosis. Just, completely overhauled everything I thought I knew.
The flip side of that, though, is that you get this amazing community, which is amazing when you spent decades feeling like you're completely on your own, like you're an alien that's landed on another planet, and then suddenly you find all these aliens. But something I've found difficult, especially since I was nearly 40 when I was diagnosed, was that part of my identity had been in believing I was completely different. In a negative way, mostly, as in there's something wrong with me, I'm completely different. And then you meet all these people that are essentially the same as you, and you're like, oh my God, I'm not that special at all, am I? I am literally, this is my neurotype, and I'm surrounded by these amazing people who are the same. But my God, where am I? Like, who am I? What is me? What is autism? I had that period of adjustment of like, I genuinely thought, well, a lot of the qualities that I had identified as things that I loved about myself, like honesty, compassion. I've run out of things, but I suddenly went, hang on, if these are autistic qualities, then can I take credit for them? Am I just, are my best qualities just because I'm autistic? And then I went down that rabbit hole. So it's a real mind spiral. You end up going into a real identity crisis, I think.
Well, to reassure you, I've met a lot of autistic people who are also dicks. So you can take credit for your nice qualities.
But it's interesting you say that about qualities and about sort of, being an honest person, being a compassionate person, because labels are something that I think both of you have had to deal with throughout your whole lives, and labels not in a good way. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those. Sarah, perhaps you can take that, because Drama Queen is sort of structured around perhaps some of the different labels that were thrown at you, and I'm especially intrigued about the ones that started with you as a child and sort of then followed you, once you were labelled as blunt or whatever, that kind of stayed with you.
I mean, to be fair, I am very blunt, but the label was more like I'm a shit stirrer, because if you speak the honest truth about a situation, and everyone's sort of skirting around it in order to not cause a fuss, you're the one causing a fuss. So from the autistic perspective, you're like, oh, I'm telling the truth, and from everyone else's perspective, they're like, she must have nefarious intentions in telling the truth. She's trying to meddle and mix things up between people, and actually, I know so many autistic people who find themselves right in the middle of other people's shit that has nothing to do with them, because they were the only people who went, hold on, if you two just you're mad at each other, and the whole room sort of goes awkward. The labels that follow me since childhood, part of it is that people tell you that you're something, and you then play up to that, because for example, I really like singing, and I loved singing as a child. And obviously, when you like doing something, you want to find opportunities to do it. And singing is, it's a performing art, so you find opportunities to perform. And so people assume that you love performing. And because there's always something wrong with you, you also love attention. And so you put those things together. You're like, well, I'm an attention seeker. Guess that's my personality. So, I tried for many years to curb those impulses, to be really loud and out there and big. And then when I couldn't do that, I was like, well, I'm going to have to play up to this persona, because that's, I guess that's who I am. And if I can't control it, then I'm going to make damn well sure that everyone knows I'm in the room. So it sort of influences who you are, and it's this self-perpetuating cycle. And I think I'm actually, ironically, a lot quieter and more reserved in social situations than I ever used to be, just because now I know, and I'm like, oh, you can relax. You don't have to do that.
What about you, Holly? Were there sort of labels that you were given in childhood?
Not even in childhood. I mean, my entire life. I've been seeing a therapist for 4 years now. So it's, it's expensive trauma that I'm working through. And one of the things she said to me before my diagnosis was actually, I don't think I've ever met someone who is described to you as often as you are. Because I'm just constantly surrounded by people who want to say, you're very, and then fill it in with an adjective. And it's usually what a neurotypical person thinks is a really clever and astute comment. Like they're pointing out something that's never been pointed out before, and they should be probably congratulated on their intelligence. And the reality is they're just microaggressions. You're very standoffish. You're very difficult to get to know. You're very, emotionally unavailable. Or you're very, whatever it is that they fill it in with. And the problem is that when people give you labels, especially since when you're younger, that's been happening my entire life, it's happened to both of us, for me, I just always assumed that if someone gave me a label, they were seeing something that I hadn't seen in me that must be true. So I would immediately assume that they were right and I was wrong. And then I would go into a flurry of trying to understand what they had seen and accept it. And there was a moment in a recent therapy session where I suddenly went, do you think there's a chance that all these adjectives being used are not actually accurate? Do you think there's a chance that they don't know what they're talking about? And my therapist was like, finally, 4 years, excellent, ka-ching. But you do just assume that the words that people use for you, you take them in, you internalize them.
Because I was going to ask about that, because I think, Sarah, there's a sentence in your book where you sort of say something along the lines of, the honest truth is that I've never really felt well. And is that partially because of all these sort of comments and assumptions that you internalize, and so you feel that everything you feel, both physically and mentally, is a form of not being well?
Partly, but I actually do have multiple chronic health conditions, so that's probably part of it. But I think when I say I've never really felt well, I think people assumed that I was putting it on, and in actual fact, like, I really, really wasn't. And like there were times where I was desperately ill, but there was nothing sort of visibly wrong with me, and people couldn't work out what it was that was wrong with me. So I would be like howling in pain, and people were like, "Oh, she just wants attention, just leave her to it," and that was pretty miserable. But yeah, so I think I mean that. Oddly, I mean that quite literally.
But I think those labels that people gave you sort of obscured that, and then perhaps didn't get the care that you needed for the things that were affecting you.
Absolutely. I still have family members who, like, most of my family are great, but I still have people in my life who, like, for example, if I need the lights dimmed in a room a little bit, will be like, "Oh, don't pander to her." And they still see it as sort of pandering to some, like, that I have to have everything my way, or I have to have everything. It's really odd that they would think, why would I invent this really weird thing that I need the lights turned down everywhere I go, like some sort of, I don't know, gremlin Mariah Carey.
I mean, part of that is that there is, I guess, some education to be done, and it is not on the two of you or any other autistic people to do that education. But I think you mentioned, Sarah, right at the beginning about Rain Man. I'd love for the two of you to talk a little bit about how autistic people and neurodivergent people have been portrayed in films and television, and how that then affects both perhaps your understanding of autism. I mean, when you said you Googled female autism, because, I mean, we'll talk about gender specifically in a second, but how that also affects what people think an autistic person should look like, or should do, or should not do, or should act, or what tics they might have.
Yeah. I mean, where do you even start? The history of autism is just this big black hole full of pain and distress and death and cut up people in basements. Like, it's horrible. And it was, it was people who didn't know what they were doing, prodding and poking at something they didn't understand, which, well, welcome to most science. And, it's amazing that someone like Simon Baron-Cohen, who I'm just going to bring up, comes up with some nonsense like theory of mind, which is the idea that, we don't have empathy, but also that we can't really understand what's going on in other people's brains. When there's such an absolute lack of the ability of neurotypical people to understand autistic people, that, like, the neurotypical theory of mind is completely absent. Like, it's double empathy. It's a case of every human on the planet, on some level, assumes that the world is experienced in the same way that they experience the world. That is human. That is being what human is. And, in the same way that, neurotypical people are like, why do you have to turn the lights off? They just assume that if it doesn't bother them, it probably doesn't bother you, and you're making it up. And I think what's interesting is that with, the original kind of beginnings of autism history, it was all focused on little white boys. And if those little, white boys, I mean, they basically just picked a tiny, tiny section of what is autistic, studied that, and then went, that is what that's what autism is. And then everybody else who wasn't that, they went, no, sorry, you're not part of our little kind of like tiny selection. There was a really great analogy. I think it was Anne Memmott on Twitter the other day, basically did an analogy of like shooting a door with a gun, and then finding out where most of the shots are and drawing a bullseye around it. Because, you can't just pick what you want and then go, that's what it is. You're like, you have to look at the whole thing, or it's not. So because of that, I mean, Asperger, let's not get started, but he called them his little professors, So it was this idea that they were, white boys who were really good at maths and physics and, like trains probably. And that has followed us through the century. And, it means that if you are a person of colour, if you are non-male presenting at birth, like if you if you are autistic, and not autistic, artistic, if you are for someone who likes to dissect words and put them back together again, if you're highly verbal, you don't fit that profile. So you get missed. Yeah. And the impact it has is it destroys lives.
Yeah, and coming back to the representation of that on screen, that's
Sorry,
no, great background. Don't worry.
Segue.
Yeah, that's the history, and here's
yes.
That's basically the representation so far. And usually they are by neurotypicals for neurotypicals. Rain Man was based on a real person, and that person was obviously a young white man, and all the sort of cinematic depictions since have really followed on from that. I mean, you look at something like Atypical, which is again written, produced, acted by neurotypicals, and I think partly funded by Autism Speaks. I don't want to get sued, but I think so. If not, sorry, Autism Speaks.
Don't.
And I obviously I work in television, and I write a lot of narrative stuff, and I'm working on some stuff that I can't talk about, which sounds really wanky, but recently I think I can say that I did a project that didn't go anywhere, and a lot of the feedback from broadcasters and commissioners was, yeah, it's really good, but it just doesn't ring true with what we know about autism. It's like, that's because you made up what you, it's like that bullseye again. You made up what you think you know about autism, and then you were like, oh no, your version of it isn't that thing that we made up.
Or they'll go, we've already got a show about autism.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I'm sorry, my entire neurotype has been completely identified by that neurotypically written show that is completely made up by you. It's mind-blowing.
It reminds me of the story the author Nikesh Shukla tells about when his first manuscript was sent out, I think I'm right in saying to agents. An agent got back to him and was like, this isn't authentically Indian enough. Like, it's that kind of idea that there's only one very narrow sort of idea of what you can be as an autistic person.
Imagine flipping that round, right? Imagine going to a TV streamer and going, I've got this great show, it's about a neurotypical person. And then being like, and you've been like, no, that's it, it's about a neurotypical person. They just live their neurotypical life. That's what happens. They'd be like, that's not a story. That's but they do that with autism. They're like, it's an autistic show. We don't need any more autistic shows, thank you. But it's just not accurate. And like you say, going through TV and, whether it's Sheldon Cooper, who is not technically diagnosed because they don't want to label it, but is so very clearly supposed to be.
He's not crazy. His mother had him tested.
Yes, which is the running joke. And it's not that I don't identify with Sheldon, because I actually do on quite a lot of levels. But, essentially the stories that need to be told are not coming from the voices that need to tell them.
Yeah, and it's always about how the autistic person inconveniences the people around them or impacts. Like with Sheldon, that's a prime example. Sheldon is just there for people to roll their eyes at and go, oh, he's so unreasonable. He needs the temperature at a certain level. He needs his special seat. It's just let him have it. It's his bloody flat. Yeah. Move out if you don't like it. Jesus.
Yeah. It is. It's that kind of, it's either about, how quirky we are and cute, or it's about, the impact we have detrimentally on other people.
Yeah. Or how brave people are for loving us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're probably quite brave for loving me, but it's just not, it's not accurate. But then what's frustrating, what's really mind blowing is that you get actual neurodivergent people coming forwards and saying, we know, we live this, please let us tell our stories. And they're like, no, I think we've got this person who's already really established in this area, but doesn't know what they're talking about. We'll choose them.
Yeah.
And that is so frustrating as a creative, because although there's something to be said sometimes with, fiction is fiction. You can make up fiction. You're writing a show. It's not real. Why does any of it have to be real? When you're talking about a neurotype, so you're talking about how someone, if you think, I don't want to get existential. I always do want to get existential. But if you think about who a person is, the essence of who a person is, it's what they think. It's what they believe. It's how they emote. It's why they emote. It's how they experience the world around them and how they respond to that experience, and also how they sensorially interact with the world. That's who a person is, right? And if your neurology is the thing that affects every single one of those things, and having a different neurology means that you are coming from a different place, and you can't fictionalize that. You can't make that up, from my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And also a lot of the things we write, even when we do get the opportunity to tell our stories, I'm at the moment really lucky to be working with some people who are absolutely not like this. And also my editors for my book just they were amazing. They just hired me and got out of my way. They gave me the benefit of their expertise in terms of like, you know, the flow of the story and everything else. But really, no one intervened and said, oh, I don't know that the neurotypicals will understand this. But it does happen. There are so many bad editors and bad producers out there where you take your work to them and they're like, we need to translate this somehow. It's like, no, we don't. We're not like, you know, we're not Martians. You don't need to translate. We're not that difficult to understand. We're not mysteries. We are very literally telling you how it is for us. So it's that you don't want to listen, and also you would rather it was something else. Please, thank you.
We've spent our lives watching neurotypicals. I mean, I've spent my entire life watching neurotypicals on TV, reading them in books, listening to them in music, being completely bewildered by everything they do and say and why they do or say it. And, you know, I've rubbed along okay. So, like, why shouldn't they, for one moment in their life, look at what it's like to not be? Like, it doesn't, you know, it seems so selfish.
I mean, I feel like I know the answer to this next question, given what we've just been talking about. But how important is it for our culture to reflect different experiences of autism, and kind of for people to write and talk about it, but for it not necessarily to be like, here is a film about an autistic person and how they are autistic? Because I think that's probably a trap that a fair amount of kind of films or TV or books have fallen into, particularly those that are by neurotypical people.
Yeah, I mean, everything I'm writing at the moment is just about an autistic person who happens to be autistic, who's just living their lives, and like, it's not they happen to be autistic and it doesn't affect anything about the story or about the character, obviously, but you know, it's not a story about them being autistic. This is an autism story, with the exception of Drama Queen, because that's obviously something that I've written in order to translate the autistic experience as best I can, which is just everything I said that I wasn't going to do. But you know, to try and be understood and to try and make one autistic experience understood. But after that, now that I'm, you know, having a bit more creative freedom to do other things, it's just like I'm writing things that have autistic characters and they're just living. And also, you know, reading Geek Girl, you know, Holly's entire book series is about, you know, a young geeky girl who is autistic, absolutely autistic, but it's not about what's wrong with her and like, why is she different? It's just about her like having these adventures, and it's a coming of age story. And of course you could talk about your own book, but it's, you know, it's not about, you know, what's wrong with Harriet.
Well, I didn't know I was autistic, and I didn't know Harriet was. So I
was going to ask about this, like,
yeah,
because you mentioned at the beginning that people would say to you, she's autistic. You'd be like, absolutely not, because obviously there are things about the character that are shared with your life.
She's like, me. I mean, I tried to like push it away when I was, you know, at the beginning of my career, because I was like, I'm a fiction writer. Take me seriously. I don't just write myself in books, but I did just write myself in a book.
Yeah.
So I just, you know, and that's what's always I had someone say to me the other day, but how can she be autistic if you didn't know she was autistic when you were writing her? And I was like, because I was writing me, and so if I'm a good writer, which I am, like, I accurately portrayed what it's like to be autistic, because I'm autistic. I'm not making it up. Like, and, you know, but because I didn't know she was autistic, it was not a story about autism. It was a story about a girl going on adventures. She got spotted by a modelling agency. She fell in love. She fell out with her friends. She went to India. She went to Australia. She does all these different things because it's a story. And that's what really annoys me, when it's like, you know, it's an autism story. But like, it's not, because we have stories. We're human beings. We have things that are outside of our neurotype. And that's what's really frustrating. So, yeah, I think lost my track.
Yeah, well, now that you've had your sort of official diagnosis, do you look at those books very differently? Like, how do you see them now, and how do readers respond to them? Sort of, I mean, readers have probably been responding to them the same way all along, but
yeah, it's interesting. I've had a lot of autistic people saying, I really identified, so thank you so much, now I know why. I've had a lot of people diagnosing themselves as a result, which is amazing. What's been really interesting as well is that because Geek Girl was about modelling, well, it wasn't about modelling, there was modelling in it. For 10 years, it sold 3.5 million copies, and it was generally received by the public really well, but often by critics with a bit of a sniff. It was like, the fluffy modelling books, the cutesy ones. I think one journalist described it as for tweens who like their heroines pretty and self-deprecating. So it was very much kind of sniffed at. And then suddenly I come out as autistic and everyone was like, oh, it's neurodivergent. And you're like, it's the same story. So it's weird, the response. But I'm just, it was so important for me with my diagnosis and the impact that it had, that, if I could help destigmatize, and for people who already loved my books to know that this character that they loved was autistic, that it could have an impact on people on like a day-to-day basis, which felt important to me.
Can't believe you didn't know.
I know. I look back at it now and I'm like, oh my God, how little about autism did I know that I didn't realise? She the first page is a list.
Yeah. And she lists reasons why she's a genius, and then she just like does a diagnostic checklist of
I know.
autism. Like,
It's mad.
has big meltdowns for no reason.
I know. It shows, and that's part of why I'm so passionate about advocacy, because I'm like, if I can get to nearly 40 and spend 10 years writing about autism and not know it's called autism, then that's how little the world knows about it. That's how much education and awareness there needs to be. But yeah, mind-boggling.
I mean, obviously you were, Sara, in a very different position. You knew, and the book is sort of hooked on that, although it talks about all sorts of other labels as well that you have been given through your life. How was the experience of writing the book for you?
I meant to say it was so much fun. I do it all again. I mean, look, it was like condensing 10 years of therapy into a year and a half of writing. There's a lot of stuff that I think was really traumatic that just isn't anymore. It's sort of like going through all these memories and defusing them a little bit, and like taking away their potency and mixing all my metaphors. But yeah, it at the time of writing, I had nightmares, and I kept phoning people up I hadn't spoken to in years and apologizing. They're like, who is this? It was a process, but like ultimately a worthwhile one, and I'm glad I did it, and had a lot of support. I'd say that if anyone ever does embark on writing a memoir, get a really good therapist.
Obviously both of you're here right now, you're talking about autism in a very public forum. You've written books that address it. How do you, now that you've had a diagnosis, how do you sort of interact on a one-to-one or a more intimate basis, like with people who perhaps wouldn't have understood you, or sort of would have perhaps given you labels that weren't very fair beforehand? Like, has it changed how you perhaps talk to people and approach people?
I don't. I talk to people who are nice. I am very lucky to be able to choose who I interact with, so that's kind of a joke. But yeah, no, I think I just tell people who I am, and if they don't believe me, then the interaction is over, and that's it.
I'm still finding my feet, to be honest. Like, I've only been out since May, I think. So, I'm still working out I'm still testing it out and experimenting in a very kind of methodical way. And it's been up and down. Like, I've had people be really great. I've had people be really awful and say pretty terrible things. Had one person say, "But you can laugh. I've seen you do it." And I was like, I did not realise that was something that was...
Didn't realise that autism affected your muscles and
well, it
yeah,
does.
and like...
But it does, but it doesn't mean we can't laugh.
Yeah.
Like, it's... But, and I tried it on a date, actually, and I had just been open about it, and so I knew that it was going to be basically, if you put my name into Google, which people always do on the evening of the first date, and it's really uncomfortable, I knew it was going to come up straight away. So I was like, I had to address this before, if it goes any further, they find out via the internet. And so I brought it up on a first date. And this guy was like, I don't know why you're telling me this. And I was like, because it felt important. And he was like, I would never have guessed. And I was like, right. And he was like, I don't believe in labels. I think we're all different, aren't we? We're all just different people, individual people. And I don't really know why you felt the need to overshare that.
Check, please.
Yeah,
sounds like
a winner there.
Yeah, I was like, and it was the first time I'd ever been open to a stranger about it. So it was a pretty, trial by fire thing. Because I was like, okay. But I felt proud of myself because I went, I think it was important, and I think that it's something that was worth sharing, and it made me definitely not want to see him again. Although he did 3 days later send me a photograph of his hot tub. And being autistic,
I don't know what to say.
his
to
hot
that,
tub. And being autistic, I thought that he was just showing off about his hot tub. So I sent one back saying, "Is that difficult to keep up? If you, is there what chemicals do you use? Does it take up much of the garden?" And an hour later, I got one saying it was an invitation, and I was like, "I'm autistic. That was never going to work." And he never spoke to me again. So at least, it feels like I did kind of get that out of the way and actually stop wasting my own time, essentially. Yeah. But yeah, it's been a bit of a trial by fire in how people respond. And also, I'm not sure, you're further down the line than I am. But there is also this element of like self-consciousness, because suddenly I'm aware that people are aware, and I'm almost aware that they're looking at me and trying to work out which bits are autistic. Like, oh, she just looked at me, or she just looked away, no, or is she, so I'm suddenly hyper aware of how people are seeing me, which I don't know if that's normal.
I know, bloody love it. My grandma is in her 80s, and she's like, oh, at my age I can get away with anything, and that's sort of how I feel now. Like, we once went out to this is a completely unrelated story that has nothing to do with autism, but I'm going to tell it anyway because I like to info dump. We went out for tea, and she asked the waiter for a lemon turd. And I was like, Grandma, you know what you just said? It's a lemon curd. She goes, I know what I said. And that's kind of how I feel. Like if I feel people being weird about it, it's like, oh, this is going to be fun. Like,
be more grandma.
I'm going to get there, I think. Yeah. It's definitely a growing process, and it's something that, but you can't, when people close to you, when I came out to my family, like obviously trying to explain it to my 93-year-old granddad was fun. I just ended up reading him a feature I'd written and leaving out bits that would upset him. But like apparently a member of my family said to my dad, that makes sense. She's never had any empathy. And I was just so heartbroken by that, because I do have empathy. I just don't necessarily show it in the same way. So if something happens, instead of me being like, oh my God, that's so bad, I'm so sorry, I'm so sad for you, I'll be like, what can I do? Right, let's go, and I'll be really practical about it. I'll be like, right, I'll go and get the car, and we'll, and so that's seen as me not being empathetic. But it was heartbreaking to think that a member of my family had basically been thinking of me as a heartless bitch for my entire life.
But that makes me so full of rage on your behalf, because it's just not true. And like, we know each other pretty well, I think, by now. And we're all friends here. I had a bit of a life crisis a few weeks ago where I was just not in a good way. And like, I just texted Holly in a bad moment, and Holly was like, do you want me to come over? I'll bring chocolates and stuff. And I was like, I really do not want anyone to see me like this. But it was the sweetest, like none of all my other friends were like, yeah, well, good luck with that. And Holly was like, no, I'm right here in the thick of it. I'm here with you. I've got you. And that was like the nicest thing that anyone's ever done in that situation. And I think that this is not an empathy problem. It's a language barrier that neurotypicals expect you, like you said, to display. They want you to perform empathy. It's a difference between kindness and niceness, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's just such nonsense that you don't have it. Like, I know you, and it's just like personally, it's just.
But they can't read it, and a lot of the time, so, for a lot of us, and I'm guessing there's lots of autistic people here tonight, like, our emotions don't often show on our faces. So something really bad can be happening, and my face will just be like, I'll be at a funeral, I'll be at my grandma's funeral, and I'll be like totally stony faced. But I'm in agony, like I'm in actual agony. And it's heartbreaking to think that people close to me just genuinely thought I didn't care, that, it was having no impact. I've even been dumped for it, because they're like, why don't you have any emotions? I feel like you're unreachable. And, I'm like, what do you want from me? Performance. Yeah. So it's, and again, it's that theory of mind nonsense. It's like, we're the ones without theory of mind. Like, you can't conceive that anyone might behave or react or feel differently to you. So it's.
Yeah. Whereas I'll like smudge my nail polish and be like weeping. So, there are lots of different flavours of autistic.
Totally. And I love that as well. Like, the more autistic people I meet, the more I'm like, we share a common language, but we're all different people.
Yeah.
And we are, and that's really lovely as well, because it's, you know, the more of us that speak publicly, the more of us that are honest as we can be, even if it upsets people. I had to go on Twitter a couple of days ago about weddings and how I don't agree with them and think they're weird and creepy and they make no sense.
I used to be a wedding blogger.
Yeah, I was
Made
gonna
it
say.
really awkward.
But it wasn't just because I feel that way about weddings, which I do, and I always have done. It was more that advocation, and it's not just about like rights for autistic people, which it is, but it's also about, this is how I genuinely feel. I'm not going to hide it anymore just to keep everybody else happy. This is how I feel. And the more people that are honest about how they feel, the more the rest of us that feel differently and think differently are supported and feel like part of, like we're not alone and that we're not broken in some way. And that is like, you know, but I got some really angry people. A lot of people who got married.
Really angry people on
Apparently
the
people who
internet,
spent 20 grand on a wedding don't want to be like dismissed on the internet.
Well,
Weird.
Who knew?
That's an odd reaction, because like that's their life choice. Like I had a wedding, and like you don't have to have one. Like it's like,
Oh, thank God.
it's like each to their own. It's like I don't know why people feel so personally attacked. Like it's the same when they tell people I'm not having children, and they're like, "Well, I like my children." It's like, didn't say you didn't. Like
This, it's not a generalization. You mentioned their public speaking. So awkward transition to audience questions. So we have 2 microphones, one on each side, and I can see our microphones. So if you have a question, please put your hand up. As you can tell, Holly and Sara are absolutely lovely. Yeah, we've got a question at the front here.
So as a proud father of a lately diagnosed autistic person,
Who is amazing.
we love her.
We
Yay, Emily.
my question really comes from the way I see, having learnt a lot over the last few years, obviously, and coming from a point of extreme ignorance. I see 2 communities developing almost. How do you see us being able to bridge the communities of those who know nothing about autism and therefore are completely ignorant, and those who are on the verge of learning about it and that sort of thing? So, because what breaks my heart is the pain that you all have gone through to the point that you are, and then how do we get to the point we can stop that?
Such a good question.
See,
You're emotional. Don't talk to her. She's not emotional. I'll never be emotional. I'll take it. I have no emotions.
Go on, Holly.
God damn it! This is why I have these in my paws.
You're distracting me with your emotions. I mean, I think it's important to remember that most of us were ignorant at some point. Like, I knew nothing at all for most of my life about it, you know, and I'm sure I've said and done. In fact, I know I have, because I found a tweet the other day that someone forwarded to me that I'd said 5 years ago when they asked me if my characters were autistic. And I said, absolutely not. And I said, Toby might be somewhere on the spectrum on the mild side. So, like, I knew nothing at all. And I think it's really important to remember that most of us, unless we were born into a family that was already diagnosed autistic and therefore, you know, we're in the blessed situation of sort of knowing who they were immediately, we just have to be compassionate and try and communicate. And I think it's about it's about communication and openness. And I think the more we talk, the more people identify, the more they feel like they can be honest as well. I don't mean me and Sarah, I mean people that are already diagnosed. And just make it something that's less scary. Because when I was in the process of being diagnosed, you know, I kept trying to look for support and online and Googling which celebrities are autistic, because that appeared to be important to me at that point. I was like, I want someone who can be like, I found Daryl Hannah, and that was good. And Anthony Hopkins. But I think it's more about like just the more we're open about it, the more we have different types of personality who are all autistic, the more that everybody starts to understand how diverse it is and how many varieties of people there are. That you can't expect one kind of thing, and hopefully bridge the gap that way, just by understanding that some of us know more, some of us know less, and that we have to try and be compassionate with each other. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I didn't know anything either, and I thought when people said that they thought I was autistic, I thought they were insulting me, and like that's how far we have to go, because I like to think of myself as someone who generally listens, but I didn't have a clue, and I had a friend who was autistic who was so much like me, like the clues were all there, and I was like, she must secretly be very good at maths. She is not, but I think it's identifying the two different types of people. So there are people who just don't know, and they don't mean any harm, but they just don't know. And those are people that you have to take a deep breath and just put on your game face and your smiling face and go, well, actually, like, and you have to do it really gently, because you might be their first, you not necessarily, well, actually them, but, you might be their first introduction to that. And it's exhausting to have to, like, I find the same thing with being Jewish. I might be the first Jewish person someone ever meets, and like, I'm an ambassador from the planet Jew. It's exhausting, but you do have to sort of remember, like, these one-to-one things, like, if you're hostile in that first interaction, you might lose that person forever. So I think it is about those one-to-one connections and like every person doing their bit, and also knowing when someone is malicious and a lost cause, because some people just are there to shout at you that you're a defect on the internet and they're not worth your time and energy. But I just think it's wonderful to see. I think partly what we might be talking about is this culture of autism parents versus autistic people as well. And I think it's so nice to see that, like, parents of autistic people, like, listening and loving their kids for who they are and showing up to things like this to support them and ask all the right questions. So you're doing great, and just keep doing that.
Yeah, it's about listening. I mean, my dad's been amazing. I did not expect it at all. I thought he was going to be, he's quite he likes appearances. He's always been very proud of his best-selling author daughter and his ex-model daughter and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, this is really not going to fit that, and actually, I mean, he did spin it a little bit. He was like, my autistic savant daughter, and I was like, no, Dad, no. But, he's been generally really accepting, and he's trying to find out more, and he, cuts out articles from newspapers, and he's not that kind of person at all. And unfortunately, some of them are really offensive articles, but, he's trying. And yeah, it's amazing about, just supporting. And I know I'm not very good because I have very little patience and I tend to get quite spiky quite quickly, which I have to try and work on maybe. But, it's quite hard when, maybe, I don't know. But it's hard when you've got, like, lots of people telling you you're broken on the internet, well, actually it's a disorder, it says it in the title, and you're like, we're looking for ways to eradicate you would want to be fixed, and it's hard when you're surrounded by a barrage of kind of insinuations that people wish you were dead, to be quite as open and warm as you would always like to be. But I think if we can keep the communication channels open and just... Because the reality is that neurodivergence is not lesser. It's not. When autistic people are not lesser than non-autistic people. We're just different. And I wrote a 15-thread tweet at 4 a.m. a few days ago, which I never published, a loss to the world, about, like, how we essentially probably evolved, together, each providing what the other neurotype didn't have. We are part of why the human race has survived and become as we are. And it's only since the modern world became full of lights and sound and 9-to-5 jobs and people and crowds and all that kind of stuff that our neurotype started to struggle a bit. And suddenly scientists went, problem with that, disordered. And you're like, we're not disordered, we're different, and we bring just as much to the table as neurotypical people.
Bloody normies.
Bloody normies. Oh, yeah, they're just coming in here with their parties outside and they're
I don't know what they're doing out there.
Yeah. But it's just trying to keep those communication lines open.
Thank you very much for your question. We have another one at the front here, and then I see these two hands as well. Is there anyone at the back? Oh, okay. Trendsetter there with the question. Let's try it. We've only got like 5 minutes, so like short answers. So we'll go here. I saw this hand, and then we'll go to this here. We'll go here, and then there's a smattering at the back there. So we'll try and squeeze you all in.
I was hoping this would be a short question, but I'm not sure now.
You're asking two autistic people. It will never be a short
That's okay.
We're only making it longer.
I'm in the thick of writing a post-diagnostic support book for autistic teens and young adults. and I keep catching myself neurotypicalizing like everything I'm writing, and I was just wondering if you've got any advice for like switching off that trying to fit. I guess it's internalized ableism bit of my brain that's like trying to make it fit an audience that is definitely not the audience. So like how to not.
Editing. That's my one word answer. Like go back and like everything that you like, take a few weeks off and then come back to it and look at it with your autistic brain on, and whatever your substance of choice is, not to advocate anything illegal, but you know, to try and get out of your own head a little bit and edit while like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I struggle with writing. You know, I constantly struggle with, like, you know, and I get feedback like, would someone really do that? And you're like, usually when someone says, would someone really do that? You've really nailed the neurodivergent experience, because that's when the neurotypical goes, so yeah, I think every time you get that, like, oh, is that weird kind of feeling, like lean in and go, yeah, that's probably exactly what I mean to say, or that's exactly the point I want to make, because that's kind of your internalized ableism, as you're saying, pushing against you and going, people aren't gonna like it or understand it. So yeah, push against that.
Wonderful, thank you very much. A question here, and if everyone that had a question just puts their hand up so we can get the next microphone. So we'll go here and then right in the middle there, so if we can get that side mic there ready as well. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. So my question is, what would be your advice for those people right now in the world where they're now beginning the journey and finding out about autism and then going through the process of diagnosis, and like you guys have gone through your stages of your life of being like, well, okay, first was autism, but okay, I'm starting to identify with this, but what is this? So what advice would you give to those people? And also, what statement or what would you like to say to the toxic neurotypical people in the world making all of this harder? What will be your statement against them?
My statement would not be PG rated, but in terms of, what advice would I give? Just be gentle with yourself, which sounds like such a cliche, but like, none of it was your fault, and you're great as you are, and there's loads of people out there like you ready to support you. There's loads of support groups, like join in, find your people, and it will be so much easier. We are not lone wolves, we're a community, and we're out there.
Apart
Holly is a lone wolf.
Holly is a lone wolf.
The rest of us will be out there in the bar after.
Yeah.
Do you want
I will
to
be
add,
glaring from
do
you.
you want to add something?
Yeah, I do actually. I think also in addition to that, I think like take it slowly, because you know, if you're autistic, which you almost definitely are if you're spending all your time researching autism, like don't like, I had my therapist say this, because it got to a point where I was just constantly researching, and it can be overwhelming because you're trying to find information. I mean, I'm still researching all the time, but you're getting a lot of information in, you're trying to repiece your past, your time, like who you are, all these fragments, you know, you're rewriting your own history, you're seeing it through a different lens, and it's overwhelming, it is emotionally draining. And we have a tendency, all of us, to hyperfocus, and we can do that on our own diagnosis. And it took my therapist going, it's okay to step back for a bit and just not think about it while you go off and, I don't know, go to the cinema or just like have a break. You don't have to be full on. It's not going to go anywhere. It's been with you for life. So just take it slowly, take breaks, you know, don't push it. And what would I say to neurotypical people? Just stop thinking that everyone is like you and that you are the default, because, you know, there's so much beauty and extraordinary things that people who aren't like you can offer the world.
Wonderful. Okay, we've got 1 minute and 2 questions. So
Sorry,
have you got a mic in the middle? Can we get, so there was one at the front here. If we can get the other mic down here ready, that would be great. So you'll be our last question. This mic on this side, yeah.
I've been stimming, never. Okay.
Hi. So I was just wondering, one of you, I can't remember which one, sorry, said that you had this sense of being broken. And as a self-diagnosed autistic who spent like 3 hours with their therapist today saying, oh yeah, I think I'm broken. And I have been for like the last 5 years, which is why sometimes she wants to smash her head against the wall. Does that feel when, like, sorry, I know that we have not that much time.
All right.
When you guys received your diagnoses, and I know that is a process that you're still working through and probably, you know, is a long-term process, does that feeling go away at all? Is, I guess, my question.
Yes.
It does.
Okay, well, that's nice to hear.
It goes away. It doesn't go away straight away. You don't wake up in the morning and go, boom, fixed. But you wake up and you go, I never was broken in the first place. It's the rest of the world that convinced me I was broken. And so as soon as that the other people's labels, other people's beliefs about you drop away, you're left with the person that you are, and you kind of find that acceptance. And it takes a while, but like I am getting more there every single day.
And you're doing the work. So yes, you will get there.
Yeah, 100%. You will not feel broken anymore.
Wonderful, thank you. And our last question down the front here, so we'll use the mic from that side.
Hello, thanks. I just wanted to come back to the gender question and how that fits in with labels as well, because I think the words thrown about usually things like abrasive and how have you dealt with that, and how do you deal with that in a professional setting in particular?
Oh, I mean, I think I took myself out of like traditional professional settings because of that, because of those judgments, and because I couldn't fit into them. And I ended up carving a career for myself in a more creative profession. I think that's something that a lot of us have done. But yeah, it is misogyny, you know, on crack. When it comes to autism, it's a special brand of misogyny. You know, it's like female autism is just like, I guess, autism but pink and a 10% extra tax. But no, seriously, how do you deal with it? The same way all women deal with it, I think, but just to a different degree. Unfortunately, it's just people suck.
Yeah. You're just going to kind of be centered in who you are, I guess. You know, like I'm the more I unmask, the more I realize that I'm not as nice as I always presented to be for my entire life. You know, I would write an email and then I would go back in and add all the bits that made it neurotypical. So I'd be like, oh, how was your day? Oh, and then I'd go through the thing and I'd be like, oh, they went on holiday. Oh, so boring. Right, okay. Hope you had a nice holiday. And like my actual email would just be like, do. That sounded like his Dender's drums, but yeah, like I would go back and try and like fluff it up, make it less relevant, essentially. And I think that, you know, essentially you've just kind of got to be you. And if people find that abrasive or too much or aggressive or cold or whatever it is that they're throwing at, you've just got to just accept that that's misogyny at work, and you've got to just...
It's not your stuff, it's their stuff. And I don't know that helps.
Yeah.
But it's not yours. Like, it's not your problem to solve. It's
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I have bad news and I have good news. The bad news is that is all we have time for. The good news is that Sara and Holly are doing a signing at the bottom of the escalators where the Waterstones table is, and I'm sure they would, I don't want to speak for them, but I'm sure they would be happy to carry on the conversation, because I know there were a few people with hands up and we couldn't get to all of your questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. You don't have to buy a book or anything. Just
So
come
go
and ask
and go and have a chat. Thank you to everybody that did ask a question, that wanted to ask a question. Thank you to you all for coming. Really
Thank you,
appreciate
Sarah,
it.
as well.
And please
Thank you.
join me in thanking Sara and Holly for their time tonight. Lovely. So yeah, if you want to.